The hen started screaming just before midnight. Out here in the Black Hills, the only thing that makes a hen scream like that is a fox, a coyote, or a person, and a person is almost always worse. Harlan Vexler felt it in his bones. The cold was so sharp it felt like swallowing glass, and the lantern light barely cut through the Wyoming darkness. He moved across the snow-crusted yard, one hand on the lantern, the other resting near the cold steel of his Colt. He wasn't a man who spooked easy, but something about this silence, the one that came after the screaming, was wrong. Dead wrong. The door to the chicken coop was already cracked open. He pushed it slow, the hinges groaning like a dying man. The lantern light slid across the dirt floor, over scattered feathers, and then it caught the glint of a blade. A figure was huddled in the corner. Fast, feral. "Drop it," Harlan's voice was gravel. The figure didn't listen. They spun around, all wild eyes and tangled hair, and lunged. The knife was small, rusted, but it was aimed right for his gut. Harlan wasn't a young man, but his reflexes were old friends. He sidestepped, grabbed the attacker's wrist, and twisted. Hard. There was a sharp cry, more animal than human, and the knife clattered onto the floor. He shoved the figure against the coop wall, pinning them with his forearm. It was only then, with the lantern held high, that he saw who it was. Not a man. A woman. Her face was gaunt, eyes burning with a desperate fire. She looked half-starved, maybe 30, maybe 40. Hard to tell. But the most important detail wasn't her face. It was her shoulder. It was soaked in blood. A dark, ugly stain that was already dripping onto the thin fabric of her skirt. This wasn't his blood. She'd been hurt before she got here. "Who the hell are you?" he growled. She didn't answer. Just gasped for breath, her chest rising and falling in ragged little bursts. Her eyes, though, they never left his. They were filled with a strange mix of fear and defiance, as if she was daring him to finish the job. He followed her gaze as she jerked her chin toward the brush just outside the coop. Harlan turned his head, just for a second, and his blood ran cold. Curled in the frozen grass, wrapped in a blanket so thin it was basically a rag, was a bundle. A small, still bundle. He lowered the lantern, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was a child. A little boy, no older than 5. His face was pale as milk, his lips tinged with blue. He wasn't moving. Not even a twitch. "Jesus," Harlan muttered. He let the woman go. She didn't run. She just crumpled to the ground, clutching her bleeding shoulder, her eyes never leaving the boy. "Get up," Harlan said, his voice softer now. "I can't," she whispered. "Ain't got the strength." He looked from the woman on the ground to the still child in the grass. He'd come out here expecting to fight a predator, a fox in the henhouse. But this was something else entirely. This was a whole different kind of monster. He picked up her rusted little knife, shoved it in his own belt, and then grabbed her by the arm, hauling her to her feet. She winced but didn't fight him. "Bring the boy," he said, his voice flat. "You're not free yet." He took them to the barn. It was warmer than the house and easier to lock. He wasn't a fool. He cleared a space near the old iron stove, threw down a pile of hay for a makeshift bed, and laid the boy down on it. The woman knelt beside her son, her hand hovering over his forehead. "Otis," she whispered, her voice cracking. Harlan got the fire going, the embers catching with a soft whoosh. The warmth began to fill the small space, pushing back the deadly cold. "You're lucky I didn't just shoot you," he said, not looking at her. He was tearing a strip of cloth from an old saddle wrap. "You'd have been within your rights," and she replied. Her voice was thin, but steady as a rock. "Name's May Dunning," she said after a moment. Harlan stopped what he was doing. He looked at her, really looked at her, at the hard lines around her mouth, the haunted look in her eyes. "That your real name?" She hesitated for just a beat too long. "It's the one I'm using." He didn't press it. He motioned to her shoulder with the makeshift bandage. "Who did that to you?" "Jumped a fence back near Riverton," she said, her eyes fixed on the fire. "Landowner wasn't too happy about it. Had a knife of his own." Harlan wrapped the bandage tight around her arm. She didn't even flinch. "So you're on the run," he said. It wasn't a question. "You come on to my land," he continued, his voice low and hard. You pull a knife on me. You drag a half-dead kid through a blizzard. I got every right in the world to ride into town and let the sheriff handle you. She finally looked up at him then. Her eyes were burning holes in the darkness. Then do it, she snapped. If you think you're any cleaner than me, you go right ahead. A heavy silence fell between them. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the shallow, rasping breaths of the little boy. Harlan stared at her, this strange, wounded creature who'd washed up on his doorstep. She was a thief, maybe a killer, but she was also a mother, and he'd seen the look in her eyes when she looked at her son. It was a look he recognized. It was the look of someone who had nothing left to lose, and that was the most dangerous kind of person there was. He broke the silence with a question that seemed to come out of nowhere. You married? Widow, she said without missing a beat. How long? 6 months. She took the flask of whiskey he offered, drank deep, and didn't thank him. I was in a cell before that, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Laramie County, my husband. He was a mean drunk. Beat me half to death more times than I can count. One night, he came at the boy with a belt buckle. I shoved him, that's all. I just shoved him away from Otis. She stared into the flames, her face a mask. He fell back, cracked his head on the corner of the iron stove. Didn't get up. You get a trial? Harlan asked. She let out a bitter little laugh. Doesn't matter if you get a trial when the other man's family owns the judge. His kin had money, I had bruises. That's not a fair fight in any courtroom. Harlan felt a familiar chill run down his spine. It had nothing to do with the cold outside. He knew about unfair fights. He knew about what money could buy, and he knew what it felt like to have a man's life end at your hands. I used to kill men for coin, he said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and ugly. Back during the war, and for a time after. It was just a job. May blinked, turning to look at him properly for the first time. She saw the scars on his knuckles, the permanent weariness in his eyes. She saw a man who was no stranger to violence. You, she whispered. He just nodded. Then I bought this land. Figured I could work myself clean. Dig all the blood out of the soil. They fell silent again. The boy Otis whimpered in his sleep, tossing his head back and forth. May immediately reached out, stroking his forehead, her expression softening for just a fraction of a second. That fierce, protective instinct was always there, simmering just beneath the surface. I just came here for some eggs, she said, her voice barely audible. Enough to get him through one more day. Didn't expect a sermon, and I sure as hell don't need your pity. You didn't get either, Harlan said gruffly. He stood up, towering over her in the firelight. He made her a proposition then, a strange, dangerous proposition that made no sense at all. You got 2 choices, he said. You can take a shovel and a warm place to sleep. You work for your keep. Or you can take my name. May froze, her eyes widening. What? You heard me. Either way, you work. But there's a bounty hunter in these parts named Whit Geary, a real bastard. If he comes sniffing around for a woman named May Dunning, he'll find her. But it's a hell of a lot harder to drag a woman off her own property when she's a Vexler, on paper, legal, and tied down. She just stared at him, her mind racing. You're offering me marriage? I'm offering you cover, he corrected her. It ain't the same thing. May looked down at her son. His skin was hot to the touch, his lips cracked and dry. He was fading. She knew it. She could feel him slipping away. She had run out of road. This was the end of the line. I stay 3 nights, she said slowly, her voice firm. Just until he's well enough to travel. Then we're gone, Harlan grunted. 3 nights, 3 years. Don't matter to me. But while you're here, there are rules. You don't steal from me. You don't lie to me. And you don't ever raise that blade again. She gave a single faint nod. He tossed a heavy wool blanket at her feet. Sleep. Tomorrow the work starts. He turned and walked to the barn door, his hand on the latch. Name or no name? He asked, his back still to her. You earn your keep either way. He didn't wait for an answer. He just stepped out into the biting cold, his boots crunching on the snow, leaving her alone with the fire and her sleeping son. May wrapped the boy in the blanket, pulling him close. feeling the fever radiating off his small body. Her shoulder throbbed with a dull, steady pain, but she ignored it. Otis had stopped shivering. Outside, the Wyoming hills were dark and unforgiving. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, but inside the barn for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, May could hear her son breathing steady. It wasn't safety. She knew that. But it wasn't the ragged, desperate breathing of a boy on the verge of death. It was something close to a beginning, and that was more than she'd had in a very long time. But the night was far from over, and the fever was a demon that wasn't ready to let go of her son. The boy burned. All through the night, the fever raged, turning his small body into a furnace. May never left his side, kneeling in the hay, wiping his brow with a damp rag, whispering comforting lies she didn't believe herself. "You're okay, baby. Mama's here. You're gonna be just fine." But he wasn't fine. He was trembling, his skin slick with sweat, his lips murmuring words that made no sense. Harlan sat on a wooden crate by the stove, saying nothing. He just fed the fire, kept the water pot hot, and worked. He was using the back of a spoon to grind up dried willow bark in a tin cup. His movements were slow, deliberate, the rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape filling the tense silence of the barn. May glanced over at him. His face was grim, his eyes distant. "You've done this before," she said. It was a statement, not a question. "Not with kids," he rumbled, his voice low. "Used to treat fever on the trail. Back in the war. Men caught all sorts of rot in the trenches." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. May could imagine the scenes he was remembering. Mud, blood, and death. He dumped the willow bark powder into a kettle of hot water, stirred it with a stick, then poured the murky liquid into a cup. "It's bitter as hell," he said, bringing it over to her. "But it works. Make him drink as much as he can." May gently lifted Otis's head. The boy whimpered, his eyes fluttering, but he managed to swallow a few sips before turning his face away, his body going rigid. His eyes, when they opened, were glassy and unfocused. He was looking at something she couldn't see. Then he spoke. His voice was a raw, cracked whisper. "Mama, don't hit me again." The words struck May like a physical blow. She froze, the cup trembling in her hand. Her whole body went cold. Otis whimpered again, his small fist clenching the blanket. "Stop, Mama. Please, stop." May clamped a hand over her own mouth, stifling a sob. Her shoulders shook with a silent, racking grief. "I never," she whispered to the empty air. "I never laid a hand on him. Not once." Harlan watched her from across the barn. His expression was unreadable. He just stood there for a long moment, then turned and walked back to the stove without a word. He didn't comfort her. He didn't question her. He just let her words hang in the air, heavy and poisonous. What kind of a monster was this woman? Had he brought a viper into his home? Around midnight, the boy let out a scream. It was a sound so sharp and terrified it snapped May out of her exhausted doze. Otis was thrashing wildly, his eyes wide with a terror that was not of this world. He was seeing ghosts. "She killed him," he sobbed, his voice shrill. "Mama, she killed Papa." He fought against her, pushing her away with a surprising strength. "No, baby, no," May cried, trying to pull him close, trying to soothe the horror out of him. "That's not what happened. It wasn't like that." But he wouldn't listen. He was lost in the nightmare. Harlan moved quickly. He crossed the barn in 3 long strides and placed a firm, steady hand on the boy's chest. "Otis," he said, his voice like rolling gravel. "You're safe now. That man is gone." It was the authority in his voice, the simple, undeniable truth of his words, that finally broke through the boy's terror. Otis shuddered one last time. His limbs went limp, and his breathing evened out, shallow but steady. He was asleep again. May looked up at Harlan, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow in the flickering lantern light. She looked broken. "He saw it," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "The night I pushed Saul, he was hiding behind the stove. I didn't even know he was in the room until after." She took a ragged breath. He saw the blood. He saw the way Saul just stopped moving, the way his eyes went empty. "You told me your husband came at you," Harlan said, his voice neutral. He was giving her a chance to tell the real story, the whole story. "He always came at me," she said, her voice filled with a lifetime of pain. But that night was different. He wasn't just coming for me. He had a whiskey bottle in one hand, and he had Otis by the collar with the other. He was going to, I don't know what he was going to do. But I saw the look in his eyes, and I knew I couldn't let him. I tried to pull him off, she continued, the words tumbling out of her now. I screamed at him to let the boy go. He just laughed, so I shoved him, as hard as I could. He was drunk, unsteady. He lost his footing, stumbled backward, and his head hit the stove, that sharp iron corner. She paused, her gaze lost in the memory. I didn't mean to kill him. I swear I didn't. But I'm not going to lie to you, Harlan. When he stopped moving, when I knew he wasn't going to get up again, I didn't cry. You turned yourself in, Harlan stated. I tried to. I ran to the sheriff's office. But Saul's kin got there first. They have money, influence. They told the sheriff their version of the story before I could even open my mouth. He didn't ask me a single question. Just locked me in a cell and told the undertaker to box Saul up like some kind of damn war hero. And you escaped. They were moving me to a work farm outside Laramie, a place for women they called unmanageable. I knew I'd never see my son again. So I broke a window in the wagon, climbed out while it was moving, and I ran. I found Otis at his aunt's house, and we've been running ever since. For months. Harlan poked at the fire with a long stick, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. He didn't say anything for a long time. The only sound was the wind rattling the barn door. I know you have no reason to believe a word I'm saying, May said quietly, her voice trembling. But I would die before I ever hurt that boy. Harlan finally looked at her. His eyes were clear, his expression firm. I believe you, he said. Just 2 words, but they were the first words of kindness, of trust that May had heard in a very long time. They hit her with the force of a physical blow, and for the first time that night, she felt a single tear roll down her cheek. Harlan didn't explain why he believed her. He didn't need to. He just stood up, pulled a heavy saddle blanket from a hook on the wall, and draped it over her shoulders. Get some rest, he said. I'll take the first watch. He believed her, but believing her and protecting her were 2 very different things. And out there, in the darkness, a man named Whit Geary was riding hard, following a trail of desperate footprints in the snow. And he was getting closer with every passing hour. He wasn't just a bounty hunter. He was something far worse. He was a man who enjoyed his work, and he was coming for May Dunning. The next morning broke quiet and gray. The fever had loosened its grip on Otis, leaving him pale and weak, but sleeping peacefully. For the first time, there was a fragile sense of calm in the barn. May sat by the stove, nursing a tin mug of hot coffee Harlan had given her. It was bitter, but it was warm. Harlan didn't speak of the night before. He didn't ask any more questions. Instead, he worked. He picked up a broken stirrup from a shelf and set it on his workbench. Ever mended leather? He asked. She shook her head. You're about to learn, he said. He showed her how to use an awl, how to thread the needle with rawhide, how to tie a stitch that would hold against the weight of a grown man. His hands were rough, calloused, but his movements were surprisingly gentle, precise. He was a man who knew how to fix broken things. Later he led her out to the corral. A big red mare watched them with wary eyes. This one's red, he said. She's got a temper. Don't ever stand behind her. He handed May a currycomb. Start gentle. May approached the horse slowly, her movements uncertain. She'd never been this close to an animal so large, so powerful. But she took the brush and began to work, her strokes long and steady, just as Harlan had shown her. The horse flicked its ears, but it stood still. Why are you showing me all this? She asked, not looking at him. 'Cause you're staying, he said simply. A sick boy can't ride through these hills in winter, and I'll be damned if I'm going to bury him just because his mother is too proud to accept a helping hand. I didn't ask you for charity, she said, her voice sharp. This ain't charity, he shot back, his eyes flashing. This is labor. You want to stay here, you pull your own weight, you earn your place. Simple as that. May didn't reply. She just nodded once and went back to brushing the horse. But something had shifted between them. He wasn't just offering her shelter anymore. He was offering her a purpose, a place to stand her ground. That afternoon, while she was rolling up a heavy canvas tarp, she finally said what had been on her mind. "You don't have to do this, Harlan. You don't have to put yourself in the middle of my trouble." He was hammering a new fence post into the frozen ground, the rhythmic thud echoing across the yard. "That man, Geary," she said, her voice low. "He won't stop. He's not like other bounty hunters. He tracks like a wolf, and he doesn't play by any rules but his own. Bounty law says if he finds me here, on your land, he can burn this whole place to the ground and call it justified." Harlan stopped hammering. He looked up at her, his face unreadable. "I don't want that on your conscience," May said, her voice pleading. "Not your land, not your name." He leaned on the heavy post driver, his eyes looking past her, toward the distant snow-capped peaks. "I once killed a man for half a sack of silver," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Didn't ask his name. Didn't care what he'd done. He was just a job, a piece of paper with a price on it." May stared at him, speechless. "Sometimes," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, "I still see his face when I close my eyes at night. The surprise in his eyes. The way the light just went out." He shook his head as if to clear the memory. "I thought maybe if I came out here, lived quiet, worked the earth, maybe it would make up for some of the things I've done." "And has it?" she asked softly. He looked toward the hills where the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "Not yet," he said. He turned back to her then, his gaze intense. "But I know what it means to do something dark and still try to live right after." He wasn't just talking about himself anymore. He was talking about her, too. He was telling her that he saw her. Not just the fugitive, not just the killer, but the survivor. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. She just folded the canvas, her hand steady now. That evening, the smoke first appeared. It was a thin, dark ribbon coiling up from behind the eastern ridge, black against the pale evening sky. It was coming from the direction of Crowbone, the nearest town, a dusty little settlement 15 miles away. A town too small to matter to most folks, but big enough to have a sheriff and a gallows. Sheriff Bramlett saw the rider before he even reached the edge of town. The man sat tall in the saddle, moving with a lazy confidence that set the sheriff's teeth on edge. He wore a dusty oilskin coat torn at the shoulder, and a big repeater rifle was strapped to his back. He had the kind of face that made decent people cross the street. The rider dismounted in front of the general store, dusting his gloves against his thigh. He tipped his hat to the sheriff, a slow, mocking gesture. "Whit Geary," he said, his voice a low drawl. "Bounty license out of Cheyenne." "You working or just passing through?" Sheriff Bramlett asked, his hand resting on the porch rail. Geary smiled, a cold, thin-lipped expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Looking for a woman. Name of May Dunning. Escaped custody a few months back. Killed her husband in Laramie. Broke a guard's nose on her way out. She's dangerous." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Heard she might have passed through here. Heard she might have holed up with someone. Fella with a spread out west of here. Vexler, I believe the name is." The sheriff's face remained a mask of stone, but his knuckles went white where he gripped the railing. Geary's smile widened. He had him. "I'll find her, Sheriff, one way or another. Just figured things would go a whole lot smoother if the law was with me, instead of in my way." The threat was clear. Geary wasn't just a bounty hunter. He was a storm cloud on the horizon, and he was heading straight for Harlan Vexler's farm. The quiet life Harlan had tried to build for himself was about to be torn apart, and May was standing right in the eye of the storm. Harlan heard the news 2 days later. The blacksmith in Crowbone, a man who liked to gossip more than he liked to work, told him everything. A bounty hunter named Geary was in town, asking questions, flashing papers, and buying rounds of whiskey for anyone who would listen. He was painting a picture of May Dunning as a cold-blooded killer, a venomous snake who had murdered her husband in his sleep. By nightfall, the whispers had spread like a disease. From the saloon to the church, everyone was talking about the fugitive woman and the quiet, reclusive man who might be hiding her. Sheriff Bramlett knew he couldn't wait any longer. The next morning, he rode out toward the Vexler place, his face set in a grim line. But he didn't get far. He found Harlan waiting for him at the fork in the ridge trail. He wasn't alone. He had two horses saddled and ready. May sat on one, her face pale but determined. Otis was bundled up in front of her, his small face peeking out from a nest of blankets. "Where are you headed, Harlan?" the sheriff asked, his eyes hard. "South," Harlan said, his voice calm. "Courthouse in Black Fork." "You running?" "No," Harlan said, meeting the sheriff's gaze without flinching. "I'm setting things straight." Bramlett's eyes moved to May. She held his stare, her chin held high. She wasn't the cowering fugitive he'd been expecting. "You got any proof she's not who this Geary fella says she is?" the sheriff asked Harlan. "Not yet," Harlan admitted, "but we're going to get it." The courthouse in Black Fork wasn't much more than a converted telegraph office, smelling of stale cigar smoke and damp paper. But the clerk was an honest man, and that's all Harlan needed. He and May sat on a worn wooden bench while the clerk drew up the paperwork. Harlan turned to her, his voice low so only she could hear. "I'm asking you for real now, May. Not to hide, not to run, but to stay. I want you to wear my name for real." May stared at the dusty floorboards, her hands twisting in her lap. "I don't know if I can carry it," she whispered. "It's too much." "It's not a burden," Harlan said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's a shield, and it's a key. You wear it if you want this life, not just to keep the law away, but to belong here, to put down roots." She didn't answer. She just gave a single, decisive nod when the clerk asked if she, May Dunning, took this man, Harlan Vexler, to be her lawfully wedded husband. An hour later, May Dunning was gone, on paper at least. She was now May Vexler, wife of Harlan Vexler, resident of the Black Hills Territory, mother to one Otis Vexler. They rode back as the sun began to set, the sky bleeding into shades of bruised purple and orange. A cold wind had picked up, and it carried the faint, acrid smell of soot. May was the first one to see it. Boot prints, near the chicken coop. Deep, heavy prints that didn't belong to Harlan. A single set of tracks, leading around the back of the house and then disappearing toward the barn. Otis clung to her leg, his eyes wide with fear. Harlan grabbed his rifle from its saddle scabbard and walked the perimeter of the property, his movements slow and deliberate. There was no sign of forced entry, but the gate to the dog pen was swinging open, the chain broken. The dog was gone. Geary had been there. He hadn't taken anything. He hadn't broken anything. He was just sending a message. "I can get to you whenever I want." "He's testing our boundaries," Harlan said, his voice a low growl, "seeing how far he can push before we push back." He led them not to the house but to a small, unassuming shed near the root cellar. Inside, beneath a stack of old timber and a dusty tarp, was a hidden trapdoor. Harlan pulled it open, revealing a set of steep wooden steps leading down into the darkness. "Storm bunker," he explained. "Dug it out after the big blizzard of '71. Kept it stocked, just in case." The bunker was small and smelled of damp earth and canned peaches. But it was safe, it was hidden. He lit a lantern, the small space filling with a warm, yellow glow. There was a cot, a small table, and shelves lined with supplies. "You and the boy stay down here tonight," he told May, "just to be safe." She didn't argue. She knew he was right. Otis curled up on the cot, wrapped in two heavy coats, and was asleep in minutes. May sat on a wooden crate, her eyes tracing the low, timbered ceiling. "He's been here," she said quietly. "I can feel it." "He'll be back," Harlan agreed. May looked up at him, his large frame filling the narrow entrance to the bunker. "You could have handed me over, you know, days ago. Saved yourself all this trouble." Harlan looked down at her, his expression serious. "If I was the kind of man who lets wolves take lambs off my own porch, I wouldn't have made it to 35. "I'm not a lamb, Harlan," she said, her voice sharp. He met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in them, a hint of a smile. "No," he said, "you're not." He left her then, pulling the heavy trapdoor closed, plunging the bunker into a quiet, muffled silence. Above in the house, Harlan sat in a chair by the cold stove, his rifle across his lap. He didn't light a lamp. He just sat in the darkness, listening. His mind wandered back to the war, to the faces of the men he'd killed, to the weight of the silver coins in his pocket. He had told himself it was just a job, a way to survive. But the ghosts of those men had followed him here, to this quiet piece of land. He had tried to outrun them, to bury them under hard work and solitude. But now a new ghost had arrived, Whit Geary, and this was a ghost he couldn't run from. He heard a sound then, a soft, long hoot from the ridge behind the house. An owl. He almost smiled. It was a sound of the normal wild world. But then he heard it again, and a third time. It wasn't an owl, it was a signal. Geary was out there. He wasn't alone, and they were getting ready to make their move. The siege was about to begin. The time for hiding was over. The time for fighting was here. Harlan didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, the rifle feeling heavy and familiar in his hands, and waited for the dawn. But the dawn didn't bring safety. It brought smoke. It started as a faint haze on the western ridge, something you could easily mistake for morning fog. But Harlan knew better. He stood on the porch, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hand, and sniffed the air. It was the smell of burning pine, and it was getting stronger. He ran for the big iron bell by the barn and started pulling the rope, the loud frantic clanging echoing across the valley. It was an alarm, a call for help. By noon the sky had turned a sickly yellow-gray. The sun was a dull copper coin hanging in a sea of smoke. Ash, like black snow, began to drift down, coating everything in a fine layer of grime. The fire wasn't just on the ridge anymore. It was a roaring, angry beast, chewing its way down the mountainside, devouring everything in its path. Geary had set the fire. Harlan knew it as sure as he knew his own name. It was a classic hunter's trick. Use fire to flush your prey out into the open. May worked beside him, her face smudged with soot, her expression grim and determined. They filled buckets from the well, soaking the walls of the house and the barn, trying to create a desperate, wet barrier against the coming inferno. Otis stayed close to May, his small face pale with fear, his eyes wide as saucers. Just when Harlan thought they were alone, he heard the thunder of hooves. It was Sheriff Bramlett, his face a mask of fury, and old Gus Whitley from the sawmill. Behind them came more men. The preacher, Abel Fry, and his 3 grown sons, a half-dozen hands from a neighboring ranch. The community. They had come. No one waited for orders. They grabbed shovels and axes, digging a wide fire break at the edge of the property line. They formed a bucket brigade, a desperate, sweating, coughing line of defense against the wall of flames. The heat was intense. The air was thick and hard to breathe. Sparks, carried on the hot wind, danced through the air like malevolent fireflies. One landed on the corner of the barn roof, and a small flame immediately licked to life. Harlan scrambled up the ladder, beating it out with a soaked blanket, his own shirt smoldering. Then came the shout from the south field. "It jumped the ditch!" The fire had leaped across their fire break. It was in the pasture now, racing through the dry grass, heading straight for them. They had minutes, maybe less. Harlan turned to yell for May, to tell her to get Otis to the root cellar. But she had frozen. Her eyes were fixed on the small sheep pen near the barn. Her face was a mask of pure horror. "Otis!" she breathed. Harlan's head whipped around. The gate to the sheep pen was swinging open. The pen was empty. Otis was gone. "No, no, no," May whispered, dropping her bucket. She ran, screaming his name, her voice raw with panic. Harlan saw him then, a small figure, bent low, near the old hay shed at the edge of the property, the shed that was directly in the fire's path. He had gone back for something. A small wooden horse, his only toy, lay on the ground beside him. Smoke was boiling around the shed, thick and choking. The dry timber of the walls was already starting to smolder. "Otis!" May screamed, plunging into the smoke without a second's hesitation. She grabbed her son, wrapping her arms around him, trying to shield his face with her own body. He was coughing, crying, his small body trembling. The roof of the shed gave a loud groaning creak. It was about to collapse. May staggered forward, her legs barely holding her up. The air was so hot it felt like it was boiling her lungs. A heavy beam crashed down right where she had been standing just a second before, sending a shower of sparks and embers into the air. She was going to die. They were both going to die. And then strong arms grabbed her from behind. It was Harlan. He had wrapped a wet horse blanket around his head and charged into the inferno after her. He hauled them both backward, stumbling, coughing, dragging them through the blinding smoke and searing heat. He had May under one arm and Otis cradled in the other. They collapsed in a heap behind the relative safety of the stone well, gasping for air, their bodies covered in soot and ash. "He's okay," Harlan choked out, his voice hoarse. "You got him out." May didn't answer. She just rocked Otis back and forth, kissing his soot-streaked face, tears carving clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. The boy was whimpering, but he was alive, breathing. The wind turned then. As if by a miracle, the strong, westerly gust that had been driving the fire suddenly died, and a new wind picked up from the east, pushing the flames back on themselves, away from the farm. By sundown, the danger had passed. The fire had veered away, leaving a blackened, smoldering scar across the landscape. It had eaten half of Harlan's pasture and scorched the side of his house, but the main buildings were still standing. The livestock was safe, and they were alive. The volunteers, weary and blackened, began to head back to town. Sheriff Bramlett clapped Harlan on the shoulder before he left. "You got lucky, son," he said. "Lucky is good enough," Harlan replied. He found May sitting by the well, Otis asleep in her lap. Her clothes were charred, her hands blistered, but her eyes were clear and steady. "I didn't come here to stay," she said, her voice a low whisper. "I just meant to rest, keep him warm, keep running." She looked up at Harlan, her gaze unwavering. "But I don't want to run anymore." Harlan crouched down beside her, his own exhaustion forgotten. "Then stay," he said simply, "and make this place yours." A tear traced its way down her cheek. "I want your name, Harlan," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Not for safety, not for cover, for what it means. For this." She gestured to the scorched land, to the house that still stood, to the sleeping child in her lap. "For home?" Harlan didn't smile. He wasn't a man who smiled easily, but he reached out and took her hand in his. Her small, blistered hand fit perfectly in his large, calloused one. And this time, he didn't let go. But out on the blackened ridge, watching the last of the embers die out, Whit Geary spat on the ground in disgust. His plan had failed. The fire hadn't flushed them out. It had forged them together. He had tried to break them with fear. Now he would have to break them with force. He mounted his horse and rode back toward Laramie. He wasn't coming back alone next time. They were married a week later, under the sprawling branches of an old cypress tree. It was the only tree on the property the fire hadn't touched. Its limbs arched over them like a natural cathedral. May wore a simple dress she had stitched herself from an old muslin sheet. Harlan wore a clean shirt. Otis, his face scrubbed clean, proudly held a pair of simple tin rings that Harlan had hammered out himself. Sheriff Bramlett read the vows from a worn piece of paper. The small crowd of neighbors who had fought the fire with them stood as witnesses. When Bramlett asked if she took this man, May's voice was clear and strong. "I do." When he asked Harlan, his voice was a low rumble. "I do." It wasn't a grand wedding, but it was real. It was a promise forged in fire and fear. A promise to stand together, no matter what came next. They didn't have time for a celebration. Life on the farm was hard, and the fire had set them back. The next morning they were up before dawn, working side by side. May planted new seeds in the ash-rich soil. Harlan repaired the scorched barn wall. There was a comfortable silence between them, the easy rhythm of two people who understood each other without needing words. They were building a life, a real one. And then Whit Geary returned. He came at dusk, 3 days later. He wasn't alone this time. He had 2 other men with him, hard-faced men with rifles across their saddles. And they weren't bounty hunters, they were family. The brothers of the man May had killed, the Dunbars. Harlan saw them coming from a long way off. He sent Otis inside with a quiet word, and May came to stand beside him on the porch, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Geary dismounted, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Well now," he drawled, his eyes sweeping over the farm. "Ain't this cozy? Playing house. You're not welcome here, Geary, Harlan said, his voice dangerously calm. Geary laughed. Oh, I think I am. He pulled a folded piece of parchment from his coat. I have a warrant this time, freshly signed by a judge in Laramie, calls for the immediate arrest of one May Dunning on the charge of murder. That name doesn't exist anymore, May said, her voice shaking slightly. You can change the ink on a piece of paper, sweetheart, Geary sneered, but you can't change what you did. The truth, May said, her voice growing stronger, is that I defended myself and my son from a man who was trying to kill us. That's not how the court sees it, Geary shot back. No, May agreed, because the court only sees what money wants it to see. By now their neighbors, hearing the commotion, had begun to gather. Sheriff Bramlett rode up, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Old Gus Whitley stood behind him, holding a pitchfork like it was a holy relic. The Fry boys fanned out, their faces grim. May didn't back down. She looked past Geary, at the faces of the people who had fought the fire with her. Some of you know what it's like to live in fear, she said, her voice ringing out across the yard. Some of you have heard things through your own walls at night. I'm not asking for your pity. I am just asking for this place to be my own. Not borrowed, not hidden, mine. A heavy silence fell. Then a woman's voice cut through the tension. It was Helen Fry, Abel's wife. My first husband, she said, her voice trembling but clear, broke 3 of my ribs with a steel-toed boot. He told the sheriff I fell off the porch. The sheriff never asked me a single question. Others began to murmur in agreement. Old Gus nodded slowly. I buried a sister who never ran from a man like that, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She should have. Sheriff Bramlett turned his cold eyes on Geary. You've made your case, the sheriff said, and this town has made theirs. Geary's face contorted in a mask of rage. You're siding with a killer? I'm siding with justice, Bramlett replied, and justice doesn't always wear a badge or come on a piece of paper signed by a rich man's judge. Geary's hand twitched, moving toward the pistol on his hip, but Harlan didn't move. He didn't reach for his own gun. He just stood there, solid as a mountain. You really want to shoot a whole town, Geary? He asked quietly. Geary looked around at the ring of determined faces, at the rifles, the pitchforks, the hardened expressions. These people weren't going to back down. He was outnumbered, but he had one more card to play, a dark secret he'd been saving. He pointed a finger not at May, but at Harlan. You ask him, Geary shouted, his voice dripping with venom. Ask your new husband what his connection is to the Dunbar family. Ask him who he used to work for before he decided to play farmer. Every eye turned to Harlan. May stared at him, her face a mask of confusion and betrayal. What is he talking about, Harlan? She whispered. Harlan closed his eyes for a moment. The past he had tried so hard to bury had finally caught up to him. He took a deep breath and opened his eyes, his gaze locking with Geary's. It's true, Harlan said, his voice heavy with a regret that was almost palpable. Before I came here, I was an enforcer, a debt collector, for the Dunbar family. A collective gasp went through the crowd. May took a step back, as if he had physically struck her. The man who had saved her, who had given her his name, was connected to the very people who wanted her dead. Geary laughed, a triumphant, ugly sound. You see? He's one of them. He probably led us right to her. Is that true, Harlan? Sheriff Bramlett asked, his voice dangerously low. I worked for them, Harlan repeated, his eyes never leaving May's face. I did things I'm not proud of, things I'll carry with me to my grave. But I left that life behind me. I didn't know who May was when she came here. I swear it. He's lying, one of the Dunbar brothers snarled, stepping forward. He knows everything. He knows all our business. And that was his mistake. A slow, cold understanding dawned on Harlan's face. He finally saw the whole picture. It wasn't just about revenge for their brother's death. It was about something else. Something May didn't even know she was a part of. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Harlan said, his voice like ice. It's not about Saul. It's about what Saul knew. He turned to May. When you left, did you take any of his things? Any papers? A ledger? Anything? May's eyes widened in recognition. His satchel, she whispered. I just grabbed it. It had some money in it. I never even looked through the papers. I've had it hidden in the bottom of my bag all this time. Harlan turned back to the Dunbars, and for the first time, a grim smile touched his lips. Saul was the weak link, wasn't he? A drunk who couldn't keep his mouth shut. He was skimming from the family business, land fraud, cattle rustling, and he kept a record of it all, didn't he? A little bit of insurance in case you ever decided to cut him out. The look of pure, unadulterated panic on the Dunbars' faces was all the confirmation he needed. This warrant is a sham, Harlan declared, his voice booming across the yard. They don't want May in a jail cell. They want her in a grave, because she has the proof that can bring their whole rotten empire crashing down. Get the satchel, Sheriff Bramlett ordered one of the Fry boys. It was over. Geary and the Dunbars knew it. They were trapped. Their lies had been exposed. Geary, in a final desperate act of violence, drew his pistol, but he never got a shot off. Harlan was faster. He moved with a speed that was terrifying, a blur of motion that spoke of a dark and violent past. He didn't draw his own gun. He closed the distance in 2 strides, and a single brutal punch sent Geary sprawling into the dirt, unconscious. The Dunbar brothers threw down their guns, their faces pale with defeat. That night, for the first time in weeks, the sky was perfectly clear. The stars were scattered across the black velvet like spilled diamonds. Harlan and May sat on the porch steps, a comfortable silence between them. Otis was asleep inside, safe. You should have told me, May said quietly. I was ashamed, Harlan replied, his voice rough. That man is not who I am anymore. I know, she said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. That part of your life is over. That part of my life is over. We burned it all away. Harlan reached for her hand. But we built a new home, he said, right here in the ashes. She twined her fingers with his, and for the first time in her entire life, May Vexler felt completely and utterly safe. She was home. The seasons turned. The blackened land healed, sprouting new green grass. The bunkhouse, once a place for hired hands, became a school. May, using slates she'd found in the cellar, taught the children from the surrounding farms how to read and write. She taught them their letters, but she also taught them to be strong, to speak up, to never let anyone make them feel small. Otis, no longer a haunted, silent boy, was full of laughter. He rode his pony across the fields, his voice carrying on the wind as he sang off-key songs to Harlan. One autumn morning, Harlan took his carving knife to the wooden gate at the front of their property. The wood was still scorched from the fire, but it was strong. He carefully carved their names into it, Harlan and May Vexler, and beneath it he added 3 more words. This land stands. The first snow of the next winter came quietly, dusting the world in a soft blanket of white. That night, with the help of Helen Fry, May gave birth to a daughter, a beautiful, healthy baby girl with a shock of dark hair and her father's steady eyes. They named her Ruth. Later that evening, the family sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the snowflakes drift down in the lantern light. Otis held his new sister, his face full of a fierce, protective love. May leaned her head back, a soft smile on her face. It's funny, she said. I used to think peace was a place you could run to, a destination. Harlan watched the snowflakes melt against the warm wood of the porch. It's not about escaping the past, he said quietly. It's about choosing what parts of it you keep, what parts you build on. May looked at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. She looked at her sleeping daughter, at her son who was finally free from his nightmares, at the man who had seen the worst in her and offered her his best. And what stays, she whispered, reaching for his hand, is enough. He closed his fingers around hers, and this time, they stayed. If you've ever felt like you were running from something in your own life, you know that sometimes the hardest thing to do is just to stop, to turn around and face it. May and Harlan's story isn't just about the Old West. It's about finding the courage to build a home, not with perfect materials, but with the broken pieces you have left. What did you think of Harlan's final reveal? Did you see it coming? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one. And if you enjoyed this story of survival, redemption, and the strength of the human spirit, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We've got a lot more stories to tell, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thanks for listening.